Hi, everyone, and welcome to the program. Today, we are joined by who, in my opinion, is the greatest international scholar of our time, Professor John Mearsheimer. So, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you for your kind comment.
Well, I recently had a talk with Jeffrey Sachs, who makes a very convincing case that China is a very different kind of actor than the US in terms of how it would behave if when it becomes more powerful, whether or not it would seek hegemony. Now, of course, one can look towards the Chinese focus on harmony with neighbors, or take the different approach, looking at the very different distribution of power in that part of the world. But this is interesting because it's really one of those issues where you and Sachs find each other on opposite side of the aisle. So I was wanted to explore why. So, what are your perspectives? Do you think China can rise peacefully, or will it essentially pursue hegemony at the expense of the security of others?
Let me just start by saying I think that Jeff is a superb scholar, and as you point out, he and I agree on all sorts of issues, especially the Palestinian issue and the whole question of Ukraine and U.S.-Russia relations. But on the matter of U.S.-China relations, he and I view the world very differently. He thinks that the Chinese don't act according to basic realist logic, that they're influenced by a Confucian ideology that cuts against realism. And I, of course, believe that all great powers act according to realist logic, regardless of their ideology, whether that ideology is liberal, which is the case in the United States, or Confucian, which is the case in China. So there's just not much difference between us in that regard on subjects like Palestine and Ukraine, but with regard to great power politics, there are fundamental differences, as I say. Uh, I can unpack the reason for those differences if you would like.
Oh, yeah, that would be great.
Uh, I basically believe that in an anarchic structure like the international system, and some listeners may wonder what I mean by that when I talk about an anarchic structure. Here we're talking about a world where there's no higher authority that sits above states. Uh, that in a world like that, where you cannot be certain about the intentions of other states, and those other states may have significant military capabilities. The best way to ensure your survival is to be the most powerful state in the system. Because if you're in an anarchic system where there's no night watchman, where there's no higher authority, if you get into trouble, if another state comes after you, there's nobody you can turn to for help. This is why we call international politics a self-help system. States have to protect themselves because, again, there's no higher authority. The system is anarchic. Uh, and this means that you don't want to be weak because if you're weak, you're taken advantage of, or at least there's a serious chance you'll be taken advantage of. And no state wants to be taken advantage of. And certainly if it's to the point where its survival is threatened. My favorite example to illustrate this is China. And the Chinese were very weak from the 1840s to the 1940s. And this period is referred to as the century of national humiliation. Why is it the century of national humiliation? Because the European great powers, the Japanese, and the Americans took great advantage of China. They did terrible things to China. Why? Because China was weak and it was vulnerable. And there was no higher authority that China could call on to rescue it. So the lesson that comes out of this, in my opinion, is that you want to be really powerful. Just give you another example that I think illustrates this, and it has to do with NATO expansion. Uh, the Clinton administration decided on NATO expansion in 1994, and the first tranche of expansion was in 1999 when Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary were brought into NATO. And the second big tranche was in 2004 when the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia were brought into the alliance. Now, all the while, the Russians complained bitterly about NATO expansion. They were adamantly opposed, but they could do nothing to stop it. And the question you want to ask yourself is why couldn't they do anything to stop it? And the answer is they were just too weak. Russia was an extremely weak country in the 1990s and even in the early 2000s. It's only recently that Putin has brought the Russians back from the dead, and we now consider Russia to be a great power. But when Russia was weak, the United States took advantage of Russia. This is just the way great powers act, in my opinion. Great powers tend to be ruthless. And they tend to be ruthless in the sense that they're always interested in increasing their power at the expense of other states. And this means that you want to be really powerful in international politics because it's the best way to survive. In my story, the best way a state can maximize its prospects of survival is to be a regional hegemon, to dominate its region of the world, and to make sure that there is no other regional hegemon on the planet. In other words, the best situation a state can find itself in is to be the only regional hegemon on the planet. And in the world that we now live in and have lived in since 1900 is one where there has been only one regional hegemon, and that's the United States of America. The United States is a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And the United States does not want any other state to be a regional hegemon. And the end result of this is we have gone to great lengths over time to prevent other countries from dominating their region of the world the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. So in the 20th century, the United States played a key role in preventing Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union, all four of those great powers, from dominating either Europe or East Asia. The United States, again, does not tolerate uh, other regional hegemons. And we worked hard to prevent those countries from becoming regional hegemons. And of course, they all wanted to become regional hegemons because they understood that that is the best way to survive. The name of the game is to imitate the United States, to do what the United States has done in the Western Hemisphere. Now, if you fast forward to the present and you talk about the US-China relationship, my view is that as China got increasingly powerful over the course of the 1990s and the first 2 decades of the 21st century, that what it would do and is doing is try to dominate East Asia. It would try to become a regional hegemon. And at the same time, as I emphasized, the United States does not tolerate other regional hegemons in the system. So I predicted long ago that if China rose, number one, China would try to dominate East Asia. And number two, the United States would go to great lengths to contain China, much the way it contained Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. So the security competition that I now see in East Asia involving both the Chinese and the United States is, in my opinion, hardly surprising. And it is driven in large part by the structure of the international system. It is driven by the fact that the system is anarchic, that there's no higher authority, and states therefore have to worry about what might happen to them if another state becomes aggressive toward them. And given this kind of world, states go to great lengths to dominate their region of the world. So I argue from China's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to want to dominate East Asia. If I were in Beijing, I'd want to dominate East Asia. But As an American, I want to make sure that China doesn't dominate East Asia. And therefore, as an American, I think it makes sense to contain China.
Well, what is interesting though is the whole concept of peaceful rise by Deng Xiaoping was premised on the idea, in his own words, that China should develop without attracting too much unwanted attention. It should hide its strength, was the argument, and yeah, avoid attracting this attention of the United States and other large powers because they would, try to cut them down in size. So, but this on its own, this definition of peaceful rise, it suggests delaying any conflict until they have proper strength. But but once they reach a certain amount of power, they would unavoidably, in this view, end up in a rivalry with others. However, it seems now that their peaceful rise has been, let's say, redefined. Now they talk about positive sum development, mutual benefit, so the whole Shanghai spirit. Um, but I thought, from a realist perspective, do you see any arguments that China would behave differently just because of its position? Because if you say that states seek to enhance security, or do they seek to maximize security or power? Because if it's security, then you would have more limitations on China because the United States, to some extent, is a de facto island state that is in its part of the world. There's no rivals, so there's more. The regional hegemon is more appealing. While in Asia, if the Chinese would seek a very dominant position in its part of the world, it would alienate, the Russians, the Chinese. They might collectively balance the Chinese. So, isn't there some pressure on the Chinese to, I guess, behave more moderate in its part of the world, given that they are in a neighborhood with all these other, yeah, great powers?
Let me say, first of all, that I don't see much of a difference between maximizing security and maximizing a state's power, because I think the best way to be secure, or to put it slightly differently, the best way to survive in the international system is to maximize your power. I think the more powerful you are, the more likely it is that you will survive. Uh, Now, with regard to China, there's no question that it was easier for the United States to become a regional hegemon than it would be for China to become a regional hegemon, because there are other countries that will go to great lengths to make sure that China doesn't dominate all of East Asia. And this, of course, includes the Japanese as well as the Americans. And with regard to the Russians, the fact is that because of the Ukraine war, the United States has helped to push the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. So the Russians are not likely in the foreseeable future to be a check on the growth of Chinese power. The Indians are a different matter, but you want to remember that India is not located in East Asia, it's located in South Asia. And although it is part of the Quad, this is that alliance that includes both India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. Although India is in the Quad, I don't think India is of great significance for checking the growth of Chinese power in East Asia. So I think that if you're going to talk about checking Chinese power in East Asia, it will be up to the United States and Japan. And then, of course, other countries will be involved as well, including Australia, the Philippines, South Korea, and some other countries. I believe that it is reasonably easy for the United States to contain China for the foreseeable future. I don't think that China is going to become a regional hegemon anytime soon. It is possible that that will eventually happen. And this gets back to your basic point that it was just much easier for the United States to establish hegemony in the Western Hemisphere than it would be for China.
Yeah. No, I just meant because it seems as if the Chinese, they realize in Central Asia they have to limit the amount of power they assert, because if they step on the toes of the Russians, then they lose a very important partner, which would instead become like an adversary. But on the topic of Russia, though, you identify, if I'm not mistaken, three great powers in the international system, which is United States, China, and that, I guess, more at a distant third would be Russia. But do you think this policy of the United States trying now under Trump seeking to align itself closer with Russia as motivation for ending the Ukraine war, do you see this as being organized around the idea of needing to align with Russia against China? And do you see it as a realistic, I guess, a policy, something that can be achieved? Because I don't see it at the moment, but I'm not sure if a medium long term goal might be different.
Well, I think, Glenn, when you look at the structure of the system, uh, what you would expect from a realist point of view is for the United States and Russia to be allies and both interested in containing China. But that's not the case, obviously, and that's because of the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war has pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. Now, I think the Trump administration understands, and many other Americans understand, that this is not in America's interests. Uh, the Ukraine war hurts us in two ways. First of all, it makes it very difficult to pivot fully to Asia to contain China, because what's happening here is we're pinned down in Ukraine. And if you're pinned down in Ukraine, or to put it more generally, you're pinned down in Europe, then it's very difficult, if not impossible, to fully pivot to East Asia. But the second point is that if you're pinned down in Ukraine in a war against Russia, you're driving the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. And this does not make good strategic sense from an American point of view. Trump understands this, I believe, and he's trying to rectify the situation. He wants to improve relations between the Russians and the Americans. And I think, in a way, what he wants to do is peel the Russians away from China and also put an end to the Ukraine war so we can more fully pivot to East Asia. And the question you have to ask yourself is, how likely is it that Trump will succeed in this endeavor? And I would say that it is extremely unlikely at this point in time. I think that the Russians don't trust the Americans at all. They certainly don't trust the Trump administration. And I think the Russians have little interest in moving away from China and moving closer to the United States, simply because they can't trust the United States. So I think the Russians will remain close to China for the foreseeable future. And at the same time, it's not clear that Trump can shut down the war in Ukraine and fully pivot to East Asia. He's done a very poor job up to now of working diplomatically to shut that conflict down. And there's not a lot of reason to think he's going to succeed in the near future. So it looks like we're pinned down in Ukraine for at least the short term. And I think in terms of the long term, it's hard to imagine the Chinese and the Russians going in different directions, and us being in a position to align ourselves with the Russians. So I don't see Trump succeeding.
Well, the whole, I guess, premise of realist theory would be the assumption that the state would be a rational actor. But if the state would be rational, we would see perhaps, we lost the Ukraine war. The Americans might leave Europe. The Europeans should, strengthen their position in Europe by, ending some of the conflicts with the Russian, diversify some of their economic ties. But when you look at, well, I guess the West, but then especially Europe these days, you don't always get the impression that rationality is what has, yeah, I guess, a very strong influence over the policy making. Again, why would you continue to fight a war which you already lost? You're gonna make a worse deal tomorrow. So this whole premise on how states will behave, do you see that reason? Because it's very hard. I can see ideally how states should behave to maximize their own security, but do you see this now from the United States and the Europeans? Again, the US is fairly divided within, and the Europeans, yeah, I don't see how that they're making the proper adjustments to as the United States prepares to leave Europe after looking after their security for decades. So I'm just wondering how you make sense of this, or if you have a way of incorporating it into uh, yeah, the realist theory, which I very much belong to as well, which is why I would like to find some answers to this.
Well, as you know, Glenn, any theory uh, is wrong some of the time. Theories are simplifications of reality, and reality is enormously complicated. I mean, the reason we need theories is to sort of navigate this incredibly complicated world that we live in. And when you come up with a theory, which again is a simplification of reality, you leave out certain factors that are sometimes going to matter, and the theory is going to be proved wrong. And that's another way of saying that sometimes states don't act rationally. And I think if you look at how the United States has been behaving with regard to Ukraine in recent years, it's not rational. It just does not make good strategic sense. But I think what happened here is that the whole Ukraine war is largely a result of the period of liberal hegemony when the United States was not worried about great power politics, where it was the most powerful state on the planet and felt that it was free to do pretty much anything it wanted without worrying much about the balance of power. And in 2008, which was in the midst of the unipolar moment, we decided that we would expand NATO into Ukraine. And this was a tremendously important decision that, as both you and I have talked about before, has had catastrophic consequences. And you could make an argument that that was rational in 2008 when there was a unipolar world and the United States was in a position to think that it could push the Russians around. Uh, but what happened is that it eventually led to a major crisis in February of 2014, and of course to a war in February of 2022. And by February 2022, when that war broke out, we were no longer in a unipolar moment. We were in a multipolar world. The United States was concerned about containing China in 2022. Containment was well in place, and it made absolutely no sense to get into a war with Russia in Ukraine. But of course, that is what we did. And in fact, as you and I again have talked about on a number of occasions, the United States made no effort to avoid that war. And then once the war started, instead of stopping it, which is what the Russians were trying to do, we took steps that made sure that the war would go on. And it's still going on today. And this does not make strategic sense from an American point of view. So I think this is clearly a case of non rational behavior. It does not accord with realist theory. And the end result is that we are in a lot of trouble. Now, my final point here, Glenn, has to go back to an observation I made a long time ago, even before I thought about what realism is. This is when I was young and the United States was involved in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, from an American point of view, ran from 1965 to 1975. And I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975. And one of the lessons I learned back then, that's just been reinforced with the passage of time, is that it's very easy to get into wars, but extremely difficult to get out of wars. And that's especially true if you're a great power like the United States that's always worried about your reputation. So the United States gets into a place like Afghanistan, and even though it's clear for at least a decade that the United States should exit Afghanistan, it finds it extremely hard to get out of Afghanistan. It takes us 20 years to get out, even though it's clear for many years that we're going to lose the war. Uh, this is the same basic situation that we faced in Vietnam, right? It was very hard to get out of that war. And the same thing is true with Ukraine. It was easy to get into it. And the Biden administration, I think, was remarkably cavalier in thinking about how easy it would be to win that war and live happily ever after. Anyway, we got into the war and we have had a devil of a time getting out of the war. And as I said a few minutes ago, this is not rational fighting this war from an American strategic point of view. This war does not make any sense. But again, it's just so difficult to get out of it. So here we are stuck in this war. And from a Chinese point of view, to go back to China, this is manna from heaven. The Chinese, in my opinion, should hope that the war in Ukraine goes on forever. In fact, the Chinese should hope that our conflicts, America's conflicts in the Middle East, go on forever. Because as a result of our close alliance with Israel, we have to deploy large numbers of naval and air assets in the Middle East that otherwise would be deployed in East Asia. The Chinese don't want those assets in East Asia. They'd much prefer to see those naval and air assets in the Middle East. So you have this very interesting situation where the United States, which considers China to be its principal adversary and a country that it has to contain, cannot fully pivot to East Asia to contain China, not only because of Ukraine, which is what we've been talking about mainly, but also because of the Middle East and the fact that, we were in a big fight with the Houthis. We have to protect Israel if it gets into a war with Iran, and so forth and so on. So all of this works to China's advantage. So the Chinese are actually in very good shape in East Asia.
Well, this is also part of what perplexed me. That is a rational United States which recognizes the objective of containing China as its main objective, nonetheless still spends all its resources now in the Middle East and in Europe. Uh, but could you say that the actions of the NATO countries in 2014 was rational? Because at that time, toppling the government in Ukraine, converting it into I guess, a proxy army to contain the Russians, pushing the Russians effectively out of Europe and into Asia. Wouldn't this fit within a rational perspective to prolong the unipolar moment, have collective hegemony in Europe? Now, I would say, by 2022, I think it's deeply irrational because it was quite obvious that everyone was underestimating that it was much more important for the Russians, and had also many more strategic benefits in terms of, the logistics and the actual industrial production. And even more so in 2025, nothing is rational about what's happening now. But already back in 2014, you were one of the first one who, said that this was a mistake. Why did you, why wasn't this a good strategy in your mind? The toppling Ukrainian government, building it as a proxy against the Russians, to weaken one center of power so America could focus on China instead.
Well, my view, Glenn, is that the United States should only be concerned with containing potential regional hegemons. In other words, the reason I think the United States should focus on containing China is because China is very powerful and has the potential to dominate East Asia. I think this is not in America's interest. Russia is the weakest of the three great powers in the system. Russia is not a threat to dominate Europe. I believe Russia is not a threat to conquer all of Ukraine, much less conquer territory in Eastern Europe. The Russians have never manifested any interest in conquering Eastern Europe, much less dominating all of Europe. And furthermore, they don't have the capability to do that. That's the key. If you look at Russian capabilities, if you look at the size of the Russian population and you look at Russian wealth and you even look at the size of the Russian military, they're not a threat to be a hegemon in Europe. The Soviet Union was. In 1945, the Soviet Union was by far the most powerful European country. It was sitting in the middle of Germany. It had hundreds of divisions. The United States definitely had an interest in containing in containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But Russia is not the Soviet Union. So the United States should not be pushing NATO eastward for the purpose of containing Russia. It should not be worrying any meaningful way about a Russian threat. And if there is any Russian threat, from an American point of view, it makes sense to let the Europeans contain that threat. But again, I don't even think there's a Russian threat to Europe. I don't think there's a threat that the Germans, the French, and the British have to worry about. Uh, so I have argued from the beginning it was a huge mistake to push NATO up to Russia's border. And it was a huge mistake to countenance bringing Ukraine into the alliance. And from a Russian perspective, I thought that this would be interpreted as an existential threat. And the Russians indeed have made it clear on numerous occasions that they view this as an existential threat. So the end result would be that you would get a war that would involve the United States that the United States shouldn't be involved in because Russia is not a threat to the United States. So this is why I argued that it was foolish in the extreme to push to bring Ukraine into NATO. But I think if you go over to East Asia, it's just a very different situation. I mean, you look at the size of the Chinese population, you look at how much wealth China has, and you look at where China is in terms of developing cutting edge technologies. The Chinese are going to give the Americans a real run for their money. I think there is some reasonable chance that in the future the Chinese will be in a position to dominate Asia. That's not the case now, and I don't think it's the case in the medium term, but who knows about the long term? The Chinese are a formidable rival to the United States, and I think the United States should be concerned about China and should be interested in containing China. This is not to argue, by the way, that the United States should look to fight a war against China. The United States should go to great lengths to avoid a war with China, for sure. But the United States, in my opinion, should contain China. But again, a different logic applies in my thinking when it comes to Russia.
Just my final question, just circle back to the Chinese issue. It, it would have been much easier, I guess, in the 90s or the 2000s to contain China. But what we see now with the economic rise of China, financially, technologically, it's not possible to prevent their further rise with containment. And in terms of military containment, the Chinese appear to be responding with, enhancing its military capabilities quite drastically, which has the industrial power to do so. So it is the last question. In what direction do you see the United States and China heading? Do you think there's some path towards some great power compromise in terms of some kind of a new balance that allows, enhance the security of both sides? Or do you think it's more likely to go towards a clash? Because it doesn't seem as if China accepts, for example, to live within the two island chains, which they spend a lot of time complaining about. So where does the U.S. and China go from here, you think?
Glenn, let me answer this question by going back to the early 1990s and say a few words about the US-China relationship throughout the 90s and the first 2 decades, or the first decade and a half of the 21st century. China was economically a very weak power, certainly relative to the United States in, let's say, 1990. And what the United States decided to do at that point in time was adopt a policy of engagement toward China. This was the unipolar moment, and liberal ideology dominated in the United States. We were not worried about realist logic. Realists were seen as dinosaurs at the time. So what happens is the United States decides that it's going to adopt a policy of engagement with China, which is designed to make China powerful economically. In other words, we, the United States, fuel economic growth in China throughout the 90s and throughout the first at least 1.5 decades of the 21st century. And China, of course, grows more powerful. And when realists like me say this is not a smart thing to do because you're creating a peer competitor, Uh, Most policymakers and most pundits and most analysts in the United States argue that's wrong because what's going to happen is that as China gets more powerful economically and as it's integrated into institutions all around the world, these are American dominated institutions, as the Chinese are brought into those institutions, that China will become eventually a liberal democracy. It will be hooked on capitalism, and it will become a responsible stakeholder because it participates in all of these institutions. And the end result is that this powerful China will live happily ever after with the United States because they are both liberal democracies. And because they're both liberal democracies, we should expect a peaceful world. If you look at what the Chinese are saying at the time, they also have an ideological story to tell. This is the story that Jeff tells, Jeff Sachs, right? And that is that China is dominated by a Confucian ideology, right? And what the Chinese are emphasizing throughout the 1990s and again in the early 21st century is that they can rise peacefully because they have a Confucian culture. They don't believe in realpolitik. They don't believe in the ideas of John Mearsheimer any more than the Americans do. So you have these two countries, the United States and China, right, that are fueled by different ideologies that nevertheless both emphasize peaceful rise. The American liberal theory of international politics emphasizes peaceful rise, and Confucianism emphasizes peaceful rise. So, for many years, people think that as China grows more powerful, right, as it's integrated into institutions like the World Trade Organization, which really fuels its economic growth, that there's not going to be any problem. Now, my argument all along, and I was pretty much a lone voice in the wilderness, was this is not the way you want to think about this. Because as China gets more powerful, it's going to want to dominate East Asia. It's going to want to act like the United States. In other words, realist logic is going to kick in. But most people thought that I was living in the wrong century and that this is just not the way the world works. We live in a world where ideologies like Confucianism and liberal democracy prevail, and we would be okay. That was the view. Uh, but as happened, China began to grow more and more powerful. It began to look more and more like a peer competitor of the United States when you looked at its economic capabilities. And then it began to to translate those economic capabilities into military capabilities. And the end result is that the United States was started fearing China. That's what happened. It's exactly what I would expect. The Chinese argued that what they were doing was purely defensive in nature. The Chinese said, what's wrong with us building up our military somewhat now that we're getting economically more powerful when you, the United States, are much more powerful militarily than us? The United States didn't see it that way. The United States saw every step that China was taking to defend itself as an offensive move against the United States. As you know, Glenn, this is the classic security dilemma. Anything that one state does to defend itself looks offensive to the other side. And the end result here is that the Chinese began to build up their military capabilities as they got more powerful. And I also believe they began to think about dominating East Asia. And as I said before, it makes perfect sense from their point of view. If you're the Chinese, the question you have to ask yourself is, do you want the United States military in your face? Do you want the United States military in East Asia? If I'm Chinese, if I'm Deng Xiaoping's or Xi Jinping's national security advisor, and they ask me, what do I think of the American military presence in East Asia? I say, I want the Americans out. I don't want the Americans in my backyard. Look, in the United States, we have the Monroe Doctrine. We do not want the Chinese in the Western Hemisphere. Well, if we don't want the Chinese in the Western Hemisphere, why should the Chinese want the Americans in East Asia? And the answer is they shouldn't. So, as China grows more powerful, you should expect the Chinese to want to push the Americans first out beyond the first island chain and then out beyond the second island chain. From their point of view, this makes eminently good sense. And of course, the Americans are not going to be happy about this any more than the Japanese, the Filipinos, or the Australians are going to be happy about this. So there's going to be huge pushback. And this, of course, is what you're getting today. So I think what's happened here, Glenn, in a very important way, is those ideologies that underpinned American thinking and Chinese thinking in the 1990s and in the first, decade and a half of the 21st century did not work out the way people anticipated. The world did not become peaceful. Confucianism and liberalism did not provide magic formulas for allowing China to rise peacefully. I think what happened here is that basic realist logic kicked in once you began to move away from unipolarity. Once China began to reach a point where it could be considered a great power. And once Putin brought the Russians back from the dead, and you had three great powers instead of one great power, realist logic was back on the table, as someone like me would expect. Now, am I happy about this? No. My book, where I lay out my realist theory, is entitled The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And I'd like to underline the word tragedy. I think this is tragic, this situation that we're in with regard to US China relations. But I think this is just the way the world works when you're in an anarchic system, when you're in a system where there is no higher authority. This is what you should expect. And this is why I was arguing for a long, long time during the unipolar moment that you would eventually reach the point that we're now at. Uh, but it is a tragic situation. I regret that this is where we're at. Now, you asked the question, where is this all headed? My view is you want to separate security competition from war. And I think there's no question you now have, and you're going to have for the foreseeable future, an intense security competition between the United States and China. It has a military dimension for sure, and this includes the alliance structures that the United States has fashioned in East Asia, and it has an economic dimension that mainly revolves around cutting edge technologies. That competition is here to stay for the foreseeable future. There's no question about it. But the really important question is whether or not we're going to have a war between the two sides. And this is a subject that concerns me and virtually everybody else who looks at what's going on in East Asia today. I do not think war is inevitable. And you want to remember that during the Cold War, and here we're talking about the security competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, where the United States was working mightily to prevent the Soviets from dominating Europe and even East Asia, we did not have a war. It ended peacefully. We definitely had an intense security competition, and there was an ever-present danger of war, as the Cuban Missile Crisis points out, and the various Berlin crises as well. But thankfully, we did not have an actual hot war. And my great hope is that moving forward, the security competition in East Asia, which is not going to go away, will not result in a hot war.
I do remember the ideological mood of the late 90s and early 2000s, the optimism. I think the realist correction to, well, a lot of this assumption, again, based on liberal theory, was that interdependence would be this absolute gain that would produce peace. I think the realist approach to political economy focus more on the relative gains, so who gains the most. And I think this interdependence you saw between the Americans and the Chinese is every year production power shifted from the US to China. Every year China developed a more advanced technology. Every year, the Chinese were climbing up the global value chains, disrupting the international distribution of labor. And U.S. debt kept growing, and the Chinese kept taking it over. So, the relative shift in power, I think, always put a pressure to we reached the point now where um, the Americans are concerned about how big China is, and of course, China also feels that it's grown too big for the American-led regional security architecture. So, this mutual suspicion, I think, was yes destined to create some tensions. It's just hoping there would be some yeah magical solution to alleviate this. But I have to say, as a consider Chinese who follow the Confucian ideology, nonetheless, they nonetheless seem to be very accommodating of your ideas, as I keep saying on Chinese, political discussions. So,
If I could make one quick
yeah,
point, Glenn, additional point. Uh, when I first started going to China in the early 2000s to talk about the rise of China, the argument that was most frequently used in China regarding why China could rise peacefully was not the Confucianism argument. That was certainly used. But the argument that was used most frequently was the economic interdependence argument, which you were just alluding to. And it was very interesting. The Chinese believed that as they got richer and richer, and they got hooked on capitalism, and economic interdependence became the order of the day, that there was no way the United States and China could go to war because you would, in effect, be killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. In other words, prosperity depended on the absence of war and the prevalence of cooperation between the United States and China. And everybody was interested in prosperity. That was the principal goal of China, and that was the principal goal of the United States. So economic interdependence would be the magic formula, and it would reinforce Confucian ideology. Now, my response to that back then, and of course it's still my response, is that economic interdependence assumes that the key goal of states is prosperity. And there is absolutely no question that prosperity matters enormously to states. I'm choosing my words carefully here. Prosperity matters enormously to states, both China and the United States. So I can see why people were making that argument. But what they were forgetting is that survival always has to be the principal goal. And survival trumps prosperity because obviously, if you don't survive, you don't prosper. Okay. And survival in an anarchic system means that you care greatly about the balance of power, as I emphasized at the beginning of the show. So, what this meant was that as China grew economically more powerful, even though you did have this economic interdependence, and even though it made everybody on both sides more prosperous, the fact is that China growing more powerful would be seen as a threat to American survival. This is just the way international politics works. Again, I'm not happy about this, but if you study international politics long enough, you can't help observing this basic phenomenon. So China grew powerful as economic interdependence theory predicted. There was a great deal of prosperity on both sides, but nevertheless, what really drove the Americans after, I would say, roughly 2017 was a word that you used early on in the conversation: fear. Fear of China. And why was there fear of China? Because China was getting very powerful, right? All that prosperity, all that economic prosperity was leading to a militarily more powerful China. And that's going to generate fear in East Asia with regard to Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and so forth and so on. It's going to generate fear in the United States. And the end result is you're going to get security competition in East Asia, which is going to trump all of that economic interdependence theory. And I think in good part, this is exactly what's happened over time.
So I think yeah, everyone should dust the dust off their political realist books because yeah, I do think political realism is yeah coming back in a big way, and I do see this era of yeah the liberal delusion, as you term it, to have blinded us a bit. But anyways, Professor Mearsheimer, thank you so much. Always wonderful to speak with you. Thank you.
You're more than welcome, Glenn. It was my pleasure to talk to you as always.